Tai sveiki visi, toliau tęsiam neredaguotą pokalbius ir šiandien turim tarptautinį tokį epizodą, pakalbėsim apie situaciją Ukrainoje ir turim svečius, tai ekspertai visi yra Rusijos ir Rusijos karybos, sakykime, ekspertai tiksliau paaiškins patys dalyviai. Tai pristatau, šiandien turim jau vieną kartą girdėtą pulkininką iš Lietuvos Vaidotas Malinionis, turim Jeffrey Edmonds ir turim K McKew svečiuose. Hi everybody. Hello, is everybody still online?
Yes.
Okay,
thank you.
So now we switch to English, and first of all, thanks to Vaidotas for gathering you all here, and you know, it's always good to have a wider perspective because sometimes we are too close to Ukraine to see some things. So maybe you guys are going to help us. So let's start from the main topic that is in the news, I guess globally, and the president of Ukraine is calling for no-fly zone. We hear, you know, our Lithuanian, you know, experts talking about. We read something in the international press. You, as an expert, you know, how do you see this? Would this no-fly zone solve the issues in Ukraine? Maybe that's the first question I would like to ask you. So anybody who wants to start can go ahead.
I don't personally think it solves anything in Ukraine. I think what it does is precipitates a war with Russia. And honestly, if you're going to do a no-fly zone, this may sound extreme. I would just reserve strategic surprise and just attack Russia outright. Because as soon as you try to enforce a no-fly zone, you're going to end up having to shoot Russian planes down, and the conflict escalates to a Russian-NATO war. The logic there and the causal chain there is pretty clear for me. And that's why I think U.S. officials have really walked away from that.
Is everybody on the same page here, or are there any different opinions about this no-fly zone? Because we hear speculations that, you know, this would be, you know, just to peacefully solve it on Ukraine's ground. Maybe somebody outside of NATO could enforce this. I'm not sure who. Let's say, for example, Australia. What do you think, guys? Besides Jeffrey.
I agree with Jeffrey because no-fly zone means direct confrontation. Yes, but I'm only, you know, considering one option. For example, right now, you know, the today's issue with the nuclear power plant in Chernobyl. Yes, yeah. And then because grid was damaged and cooling system was disabled, and now everything works on generators. So, and in this case, it's a danger already, you know, present for the NATO countries which are in Europe. And then maybe it's possible to consider like a limited no-fly zone, yes, to announce that, yes, we guys want to take care about that nuclear power plant. I'm not saying that entire Ukraine, but so maybe that game could be possible. I'm not sure. Of course, no-fly zone, you know, above all territory of Ukraine, it's a war. But if you take only small part, or at least if that is possible and how that's possible, I am not, you know, an Air Force expert, but I think that should be also probably considered by our NATO allies, how to reinforce, you know, security of very strategic and important nuclear power plants.
But how is it possible to ensure this no-fly zone over such small areas? And where do you place the radars then? You know, where do you place the jets or the rockets that gonna, you know, actually enforce this?
Of course, it would take bigger territory. Of course, it's not only 50 kilometers around. You know, you should cut some gap, or you should cut some part of Ukraine to reinforce that zone. So, but that is, I think it's pretty complicated. But I think that option should be considered as well. Probably.
And I would just disagree in the sense that I don't know that announcing a no-fly zone inevitably leads to World War III. I don't know that we know that would be the Russian reaction, given how many planes they've lost. Maybe they would be relieved. But I think it is imperative on the West, if we're giving a hard no, if NATO is giving a hard no on a no-fly zone, when we know that this is a critical area to level the playing field right now, it's to come up with a creative yes, which is, what are we giving the Ukrainians if we're not going to do this? And I think that's right now the area that needs to be focused on. What does additional air defense look like? What does additional capacity to the Ukrainians look like to fight in the air? What can we be creative with drones, with other missiles, with what we're providing? And I think that rather than getting in an argument that's just going to cause division, we need to find the creative yes. And I think that's where I am on this right now.
Okay, so it's not too far from this topic. We see that the situation. There was some kind of a solution to send planes to Ukraine, and Ukraine pilots could basically do the rest. In terms of at least some control of their air, some skies. But we see that Poland and US is playing ping pong. On the other hand, we see Turkey, which is, well, you cannot compare, it to US. It has, but their stance, they are giving drones to Ukraine, and they actually don't mind, any escalations or something like that. So why is it possible for Turkey to supply drones, and why is this so complicated for the allies, the NATO allies, to find a solution how to basically get those Soviet era planes to Ukraine, where they can, well, be a really serious, new game changer, maybe, if I see it correctly.
Well, I think that the planes, I mean, I'm not necessarily opposed to providing planes. I think the Poles need to do it themselves and not try to hang it off of us. In Germany, but I mean, I do think that they would be escalatory, and that's not a reason not to do it. I think it's more escalatory than the UAVs, even though on the ground the drones have had quite an impact. The Ukrainian Air Force hasn't been a strategic factor here. I don't know this would tip the scales in that favor. Russia does have advanced air defense systems, even though they are vulnerable to being targeted by drones. So I think it's a complicated question, but I think the other thing here is it's a much more visible escalation in the sense of these guys taking off from a Polish air base and then flying to Ukraine and being given to the Ukrainians there. So it's just something I think the U.S. is cautious about as far as escalation goes, because we already have so many things in place right now that are deteriorating the Russian economy. The Russian forces aren't doing well, and so I think there's just a pragmatic, let's see how things are going before we start just flying jets into Ukraine.
Anybody else on this question?
Yes, I agree with you, Jeff, but also I am thinking, because, in a war, normally you also organize deception, yes? So, and I also understand Poland, it doesn't want to become a target. Yes, it should be, the Poland wants to have, strength of coalition support, NATO allies. But I'm just, brainstorming, maybe, how deception in this case should work. Maybe exactly what is happening. Yes. Maybe those planes are being processed, and NATO allies are playing deception, and that would be maybe ideal, to confuse also the Putin. I'm not saying that it is, happening right now like this, but some kind of deception probably also would be welcome in this case, in order to confuse belligerent side.
But like people have said, this has become one of the more transparent wars we've ever seen. And if the Russians have learned anything, it's that they're having a very hard time masking the movements of their units. So I would be very skeptical that we could get planes into, if this is what you mean, that we could get planes into Ukraine without the Russians knowing it, because they're not relying on just open source information. They also have their own intelligence services, as poorly as those have performed. So I just don't know that you could pull it off that way. Again, like I said, I'm not necessarily against it. I just think it needs to be thought through. And like I said, there are other drivers here that are changing things on the ground and changing things in Moscow. And I think it might pay to give that a little time to see what direction that's going.
Yeah.
I agree with Molly. I mean, I agree with the continuing to provide. I mean, if I were advising the Ukrainians, I would be telling them we just need to hold out as long as we can, because this is not winnable by the Russians. It's not politically winnable by the Russians. And I really don't think the Russian economy can take this. Now, where that leads us is probably going to be something for this conversation. But I do think we need to think about creative ways and be forward-leaning and providing the Ukrainians what they need to attrit Russian forces.
Yeah, and I just think that creativity is the thing that's so important, and potentially where our Baltic allies can help in creative thinking. I think that it gets harder to say just wait and see when the wait and see has a weight in Ukrainian blood, and it gets harder. I think there's so many other factors here that are important in terms of the pressure that Zelensky is putting on everyone to do the morally right thing, and the cost that will have in the West if it seems like inaction, if the perception is that we are not doing enough, if the perception is that we're fine with the current level of Ukrainian dying. And I think certainly within the public in Europe, this is a tremendous mobilizing factor. People are very personally engaged in raising money and helping refugees and doing things for Ukraine. And I think it becomes a political issue as well. So I think there's a range of factors other than like, let's just wait and see what happens in Moscow. Like, what's the action on our side that I just think we really need to be forward leaning on.
But Molly, let's not use like rhetorical false dilemmas. Simply saying that we're not willing to go 100% with everything we have means we're okay with Ukrainian blood. That's not at all what I just said. I just said there's a pragmatic approach to this that doesn't involve us immediately going light speed to war with Russia, which I think there's actually a very high probability regardless of what we do right now. But I mean, simply saying that we're, not instituting a no-fly zone means we're okay with Ukrainian blood that's not a thing.
But that's also not what it's not what I just said. So just to be clear, that's not what I just said. I'm saying in reality, there is a cost per day in Ukrainian blood. Sure. And people are aware, everybody's watching it live, as you said. And so I think there's a range of factors beyond just the let's see what's happening in Moscow one that need to be weighed in that equation that you're talking about. That's all.
But I just want to clarify this theoretical question, like modeling, the outcomes. Let's say, there is a no-fly zone and, the West imposes it. Would it be enough to win this war in Ukraine? Would it be possible to get those forces that are already in Ukraine out if there was no basically support from the air, or very little support from the air in terms of Russian air forces and missiles?
I was just that guy on mute. I still don't see how this doesn't. I mean, there's no way that we start flying, combat air patrols over Ukraine, and Putin says, "Oh, well, they're flying in combat air patrols. There's a no-fly zone. I'm going to go ahead and ground the Russian air forces." I mean, this is an existential issue for him. He can't lose this, and so he's not going to let us fly over Ukraine, right? And I also don't agree with the idea that you can sliver off part of Ukraine. If I were Putin, you'd slivered off part of Ukraine for no-fly zone. That's exactly where I would send my fighter aircraft. Because I just don't think, like I said, if we're going to do that, we should just attack Russian forces, right? Because that's what it's going to lead to anyway. And so we might as well maintain the surprise and the tactical advantage and just lean forward and attack Russian forces. Because in my mind, they're really, in the end, they're kind of the same thing. Otherwise, you're not enforcing it. And then what have you done? You've lost credibility. You've announced a no-fly zone that you're not willing to enforce. Right. So where are you then? So I just think at this point, it's a non-starter. And I don't think it actually helps the Ukrainians out. I mean, unless you think a wider war between NATO and Russia helps the Ukrainians out, then maybe it does. But I think that it pretty quickly escalates from there on out.
Anybody want to add, or let's move to the other topic?
Pretty clear answer. No.
Okay, so there was a question from our Patreons, like, what about the Russian intelligence? Did they do the job before, planning this war, or why did they underestimate the resistance, the situation, the political winds in Ukraine? Because we heard that some in the first wave of these soldiers, they had their fancy uniforms, and basically they were waiting to be greeted with flowers and vodka and bread. Where did this go wrong in the first place, that the Russians did not prepare themselves properly, or is it a terrible condition of that army, and the problem is there, not in the preparation of intelligence?
I think definitely their decision makers, the planners, they underestimated Ukrainian capability. Yes, and
but how is it possible with the Russian, military personnel, and it's a huge country, it's properly militarized, it has a budget of like 40% GDP for the military. How did they fail so?
Yeah, but don't forget, the Russia's chain of command is dictatorship. Yes, so and sometimes lower commanders, even they have opposite information, they just cannot tell that it will not work, because they are, high top level leaders want to make sure that it will work. And yes, definitely everything was very bad, looks like very badly planned and prepared, and they we are hoping for the fast victory. That's the reason they attacked in many directions at once. They spread their forces. They didn't organize a mass on the certain areas, and so they couldn't make it. And also there are lots of proof, additional proof, that they were planning to have a fast victory, including those parade uniforms which were discovered in vicinity of Kiev. Yes, even they are preparing to parade their victory. So that's also interesting. So
that's
maybe
ridiculous, probably.
yeah. Yeah, and I think Jeff has more to say about their planning and the tactics on the ground.
Yeah, so I mean, what I've labeled it as, only in part. Clearly the Russian military is performing more poorly than a lot of us, myself included, have predicted for a long time, right? So that's something in the Russian military analytical community we've got to come to terms with. That being said, I think it's hard to overstate how much the political leadership has failed the Russian military. Kind of lucky on that end, I think, and I'm glad that's the case. But I think that, I term it a failure of operational art. And what I mean by that is the things that military commanders and their staffs do to prepare for complex military operations. And because of the unpopularity of this, because of Putin keeping the idea that he was the plan to invade the entire country secret, no one in the military knew this. And I think that the stories from individual soldiers that they thought were on training missions, I think that's representative of the force overall and quite a ways up the ladder. And so they were not given any chance to prepare or plan in the way that those of us in the military plan. And I think they were politically told, like, you're going to drive in. Clearly the plan was, and this is again to your point, I agree with you on the intelligence failures. The idea was that Ukrainians would just fold, that they were honestly being ruled by people they didn't want to be ruled, that people that didn't want to be in power. If they could get to Kiev in time, they'd be greeted with open arms. Once Kiev was in control, the rest of the resistance would fall apart. And so there's so many bad assumptions there. The Russian military is just not being used in the way that it was intended. That being said, though, there are things that are still kind of mysterious to a lot of us. We think we might understand why the Air Force isn't being used as much, but electronic warfare systems. I've written about, command and control systems that the Russians have been working on for decades, and those don't appear to be in much use. So there's a lot here for us to unpack as this unfolds.
And I think maybe just one addition to that relates specifically to sort of the broader information domain. I think there's going to be a lot of analysis of whether the Russian magic information bubble worked against them in this case, particularly that they weren't watching anything from outside. You don't have to be a super secret squirrel intelligence asset to walk into Ukraine, sit in any bar with a bunch of hipsters and some guys who are veterans from the front and understand that this country is going to fight if the Russians come over the wall. That was anybody, if you spend any time in Kyiv, you understand that this is the dynamic of the country. So it is really shocking, the sort of disconnect between basic realities of what this was going to look like once the go button was pressed, and the operating assumptions that were clearly being used to design the plans. So I think there's going to be a lot of analysis of this. Were they huffing their own Kool-Aid too much? Was it something broader than that? Is it just a total failure because of the centralized control? I can't answer that, but I think there's a lot of very interesting things to dig into as we learn more in the future.
But I want to emphasize one thing here. When I was asking about this failure, like the condition of the army that we see in, of course, those videos from Ukrainian sources, they might pick out the worst of the worst, but still we see some Stone Age, equipment being used. My point is, what is the condition of their air force? If the tanks and the rest, are not basically functioning properly. So, is there any speculations, in the West, like a community of where your bubble, I mean, about the possible, condition of let's say the airplanes and the not even airplanes regarding this, they're always stressing out, that there's a tactical atomic weapon and a strategic atomic weapon. The question is that operational? When was the last time the Russians properly tested such things? Is there an opinion about this?
I can talk about the Air Force. I don't want to go first all the time, but I think the Air Force has been kind of puzzling. We think there's a risk aversion to losing aircraft, and that comes from, not as much pilot training, probably not as much planning for complex air operations, the kind that they would require of Ukraine. The success of the Ukrainians in using air defense systems, we think has kind of created a dilemma for the Air Force, in that they're using unguided munitions. In order to use those accurately, you got to fly low, and if you fly low, you get tagged by surface air missiles, and if you go high, you're inaccurate, right? And so there's definitely, they've used more of these systems, but like the Su-34 is a very advanced aircraft, and it's they're not using their precision guided munitions. One thought there is that they've used enough of those, they want to hold them more in reserve in case this conflict goes wider. And so maybe that's another reason why they're not using the Air Force as much. Maybe it's a combination of those things, but it's really hard to tell. And I'll say it's for those of us that thought about how this war would unfold before it happened. Like I myself had always said, there was going to be a large aerospace operation to take out critical military infrastructure and gain and maintain air superiority, and that clearly hasn't been the case. And so I think it's from a military analytical perspective, it's interesting, and I think it's it plays well for the Ukrainians.
Anybody else want to add on the condition?
Yeah, I think also on the ground, we can see pretty outdated hardware. Those infantry fighting vehicles and logistical vehicles. So it looks like really not in the very good condition. And of course, logistical planning, logistic support looks like it is a failure. So, and now I don't know, there are no indications from, for example, Bellingcat that the offense will collapse soon. So, and not only Bellingcat, also another, organization of analytics also predicts similar but only, I am thinking what kind of, how do we know that it is collapsing? So, and I think if we will see more numbers, bigger numbers of prisoners of war, which are, approaching to the Ukrainian side, that could be also the sign that everything is ruining. But nevertheless, now we see that they also organizing reinforcement from Russia and even from Pridnestria, yes, region. So we will see, and definitely they will not have enough time to prepare those reinforcements personnel to be properly integrated into the battlefield. And now it looks like that what they have, they want to continue with their very small achievements in comparison. Well, it is actually, they are not controlling actually Ukraine, as we can see. They don't control any significant city. They're only controlling some roads, and they having right now problems. But that's not the end, definitely, of it.
Molly, would you like to add something to this?
I mean, obviously, I'm not going to add strategic genius on any Air Force commentary here. But what I would say is what Vaidotas was just talking about, I think is important, just that it's clear we didn't see stuff we needed to see also. I mean, yes, the Russian failure is vastly more significant in that they're the ones who decided to execute this war, but there's stuff we're not seeing too. And I think we have to be aware of that as we are looking at all the pieces moving around, trying to figure out is this it? Is there more? What's next? Is it here? Is it outside? Is it something else? Is it horizontal? And I think we all just need to be creative in how we're approaching information that we see as well. Because I think, I think what we've seen so far says that we need to do that. But I think everybody's aware of that. So hopefully we're keeping our eyes on all the different balls.
All right. So I want to ask about the manpower because, I had a conversation with the, army official, ex-army official yesterday, and he was saying that in the end, what matters is actually the manpower, and we know that the combat-ready part, of the military in Russia is not that big, and it looks like 2/3 of that was already by the borders of Ukraine. Is this information correct, or there is some kind of I don't know, they have some additional, pockets where they can take out those soldiers, trained soldiers. I mean, not some kind of, policemen from Kaliningrad or Padniestre or something like that. What is the situation? How much more force they can basically, in terms of manpower, put on the ground in Ukraine?
I mean, there are more units that they can bring over. There's unconfirmed reports of additional units coming from the east. I dug into that, and I have like 2 sources on that, so I'm not sure about that. But already, I mean, when you look at the border between Russia and China, it's the least that's been militarized in recent history, right? And so I think the Russian military is stretched pretty thin. What I was seeing literally an hour before this is that the Russian Duma is passing a law that it actually, I think, drafted 4 years ago. Need to do a little more research on this. Drafted 4 years ago that actually makes it easier to keep conscripts accountable. Apparently, it closes a loophole where in Russia you have to deliver the conscript, the notice of conscript to an individual. That's harder to do in Russia, and that's one way people get out of it. But now, if your name comes up on the list, it's your responsibility to go to the registration section, or you're held accountable. And so we're starting to see things like that. And I think that's concern on the Russian part that they are stretched pretty thin. And so while I think there are more units to bring in, I think manpower issue is a real issue. And also, one thing we didn't mention is the morale, that lack of planning, all of the other things. Like, if you go to Iraq or Afghanistan, you're a U.S. soldier, you're going there. You know what that entails. You can mentally prepare for that. You train for that. It's not a surprise. To be a Russian soldier training in Belarus on some exercise, next thing you know, you're having Ukrainians shooting high-end anti-tank missiles at you and kill all your buddies is probably shocking, to be honest. And I think it's interesting that we're seeing like, it's not like Private Edmonds decides to take off to wherever and hang out until the war's over. You're seeing like, 4 and 5 vehicles lined up that are completely fueled and functional with no crews. So if I were a military commander in Russia, I would be very concerned about that kind of development where you have small units, deserting altogether, because that, I'm not going to say the Russian military is going to dissolve right now, but I mean, that's a serious concern for them.
Yeah, and also I can add, according some estimations, that Russians before they deployed to the border of Ukraine 70% of their conventional force actually. So what they have, so it's actually a big number. And now there is an estimation that they already 70 to 90% out of those forces are in Ukraine, and they are stuck, So definitely it's a huge force, and it's a lot of money, a lot of resources, and definitely they probably will try to save the situation, yes. And if they don't have very high level ready force, yes, they will use what they have. And they have, of course, big pocket of reservists, sure. The only problem is the lack of time to prepare them, and the lack of battle-ready units. So it will be actually very, very unprofessional, and lots of casualties actually from Russian side. And yes, motivation is very low, and and I can predict it wouldn't get better from the side of motivation. They don't have victories. Their general was killed, yes, just yesterday. So this is also adds something to the motivation. And maybe Molly wants to say something from your side.
Yeah, no, I think in the Gerasimov terminology, the spiritual resources of the Russian forces are quite low right now. And I think the Ukrainians have done a good job both of managing their own resolve and sort of motivational factors, and how they're using information, and how they're motivating the citizenry, and how they're telling stories and making myths and roping everyone in to gain support inside and outside of the country. And that a lot of that targets the Russians too. And I think if this was the first group who was probably at least somewhat prepared for what they were stepping into, the guys coming after are going to have more awareness of the fact that this isn't great. And I think that's going to be very interesting, exactly for the reasons that Jeffrey said, which is, there's clearly stuff that's just been walked away from already. And I'm sure we're seeing as many of those pictures as the Ukrainians can find to sort of create this perception of desertion, but that also exists. And so that's like, what is that? Where are those guys going? Are they all turning themselves in? Are they going someplace else? Like, what does that actually turn into as a force within the Russian forces, and how that starts to have sort of a decentralizing vector will be very interesting to me to see sort of how that plays out in what we see going forward.
So I want to ask here, right now we have this so-called or sort of fake ceasefire. What do you think, is happening there? Are they completely changing their plans, or we don't hear something? What is this time, actually, what does that mean for the Russians at the moment? Are they replanning? Are they regrouping, or, something else?
Yeah, ceasefire could mean many things. And one of those things, could be regrouping, or, maybe they cannot advance anymore because of lagging logistics, so it could mean this. So it's and yes, the decrease of intensity, in order to advance to Kiev, we have some kind of estimations that they are preparing some troops for to attack Kiev, and according some experts, it is estimated that in 60-something hours, yes, we will be ready for the main advance. And I'm not sure if that will be. Can we name that, advance as a decisive battle? And I don't know if we will see decisive battle in the nearest future. And it's pretty hard to actually describe what is decisive battle in this case. Yes, because Russia has asymmetric superiority with their short-range, short-range attack tools, ballistic cruise missiles, and long-range artillery. Yes. So, what is decisive battle? But nevertheless, yes, I think everything what is happening very much upsets Putin, and Putin. I think he doesn't have the luxury to lose this. So, and situation now is like this. And maybe
but what options does Putin have at the moment? Like, what can he really do? Like, burn Ukraine to the ground, take the soldiers back home, where he's gonna be considered a loser. What are his options? Like, escalate World War III?
Actually, this is like, in the chess game, there is a Zung Swang, how it's called, then the situation is, then every move which you choose is only worsening the situation. So actually, in reality, he lost this campaign, and he lost this battle on the Ukraine. But he cannot afford to acknowledge it. And even he destroys entire country. Yes. Can I ask, is it a victory or what? Yes. If you destroy a lot of cities, and you still have pockets of resistance, it's many years you will have commit your forces and troops in order to hold that status quo.
And especially when you go into this battle, as the narrative was that Putin is going to liberate the Ukrainians and basically get rid of the drug addicts and neo-fascists and stuff like that. So
exactly. And I also read one expert. He compared that Hitler had cemented allies against the Germany starting 1943, and Russia begins from 43. So they already, in comparison, if you compare World War II, Russia is already in 43, and you remember then the war was done in that case. So this is my
my outlook is pretty dark, I'll be honest. I think the whole thing culminates, and what I mean by culminate is like in the military sense, where you can't really do anything more. Right, your offensive has culminated. You can't really go on the offensive anymore. Where Putin has a conflict in Ukraine, and I hate reducing Russia to one person, but like in this particular case, this really is about just him. But you have the situation in Ukraine where he can't achieve his political objectives. If he manages to get a puppet regime into Kyiv, it can't leave because that regime wouldn't survive the day. And so you have this incredibly costly, unjustified war going on, and at the same time, I can't stress this enough. I don't see how the Russian economy survives this in the midterm and near term. And so at that point, if you have a combination of riots in the streets, your economy's going to hell, and if he feels like he's losing control of the Russian state, I personally think that he will intentionally instigate an Article 5 against NATO, and the whole point of that would be, you need to remove these economic restraints because they're the same thing as warfare. Otherwise, you're going to have an all-out war between NATO and Russia. And so that's the only positive outcome I can think of is that somehow he doesn't survive. And that's very hard. I don't understand. I mean, everybody's trying to figure out the mechanisms by which he would leave or get kicked out. And those are not very clear on how that would happen because there's no clear successor or somebody to step in. And so I think that there's a very significant chance. I think I told someone the other day it was 67% chance in my mind that this ends up in a NATO-Russia war with all of the nuclear trappings and dangers and escalation problems that comes with. Sorry to be so dark, but that's what I'm trying to work with.
I think there's sort of the magical, but what if Putin disappeared, thinking, which is maybe a nice thing to spend time on, but not practical. I think we all agree. The second is, I think there's some Ukrainian thinking that and Zelensky communicated this when he was speaking to the US Congress, and some of his other people have been communicating it as well, that the Russians might be looking for, Putin might be looking for a way out in this nuclear strategy that they're pursuing of seizing the nuclear plants, that this might be a part of trying to actualize their fake messaging about Ukraine pursuing nuclear weapons, and now they can say they've secured the nuclear weapons and it's all fine or something. I think that's kind of wishful thinking, but I think people will keep looking for signs that everyone is looking for an off-ramp. I think the third scenario, as Jeffrey outlined, is there's confrontation and escalation in all directions. And where I am on this is very much we, collective NATO and bilateral countries that have an interest in Ukraine, need to be thinking extremely out of our comfort zone on, if this is the reality we're facing, what are we willing to do to not have that be the reality that we get to? An uncontrolled escalation where we're caught off guard. And I'm not advocating that like a NATO-Russia war is going to be fun and we should just jump into it. That is absolutely not what I'm saying. But I'm saying we need to be thinking about what are those options? What are the best of the terrible options? And we need to be really seriously discussing that amongst ourselves as allies and as individual nations. We have more to bring to this too. Russia's got some stuff in reserve, so do we. And like, what does that look like? What's the everything but the nuke option if it gets to that? And I don't think people are comfortable. Right now, it's what I see in commentary and pressure from political circles is very much, we just need to like glide path Ukraine into a forever insurgency and it'll just stay there and it'll be okay. And I'm just not sure that that's one, reality, or two, sustainable. And again, if it happens, not what I choose, but okay. But all this other stuff we need to think about. And I don't know that there's been a lot of that done yet.
But
yeah,
here,
I would agree with Molly. I was just going to say, I completely agree with Molly that we need to be very prepared for this thing. And I am not, when I lay out that dark scenario, I run the trap of people thinking that we should avoid all escalatory steps that could even possibly lead to that. And that's not what I'm saying at all. Just as a military guy, we just need to be ready for that, like Molly said. And we do need to think of, I can't think of any actions we've taken that I actually disagree with. I think the solidarity displayed by the West, the extreme economic stuff we have done, I'm behind all of it. Even if this does drive it to some kind of culminating point, because that might be what we need. That would be a highly controversial statement, here, and I'm fine with that. But I think the West has kind of spoken up and said that what we're seeing in Ukraine just isn't acceptable. And so we're going to raise costs until the costs are just too much for Putin to sustain in the long run.
But Jeffrey, here's a question right away. If we push those sanctions further, there is still some space basically to be advanced, on those sanctions. So is the Western society, like in general, are they ready for something, that they haven't experienced the last 50 years? The living generation doesn't understand, what is war, because, the Ukrainians, they saw the war the last 10 years, so they were basically not shocked. But how would the West react if, we have a wide conflict? Is it really possible to comprehend? So
a lot of, this goes back to what Molly and I were talking about earlier about whether or not this is sustained and there's a cost to it each day. I should be clear that my writing assumption is that the stuff that happens to the Russian economy happens more sooner than later. I think this is going to have kind of an exponential failure rate pretty soon. And so if this, and that's what, when I say like, let's wait and see, I'm literally talking in terms of weeks and maybe a month, not let's drag this thing out for years. I think pretty fast you're going to start seeing the impact on the Russian economy. And so I probably should have made that clear earlier, that I think that by wait and see, I mean, let's wait a couple of weeks and see what the Russian economy does and how the situation unfolds. But yeah, I wouldn't want to advocate for just an infinite war where Ukraine just resists forever. I think that, I mean, the death toll in that is just astronomical. And probably not sustainable on either side.
But Jeffrey, knowing the Russian, cultural thinking, they can basically be on, vegetables and stuff like that for a long time. Because if the narrative is going to be shifted in Russia that the West is trying to beat us and look, they're doing this and that, they can hold out quite long. If in our standards, if there is, your bank card is not working, the supermarket is not working, the gym and stuff like that, it's a shock. For Russians, it might be a shock in Moscow or maybe some other few cities, but the general population, well, I mean, they are living in 19th, 20th century, junction conditions.
I don't know. I would push back against that. I think that's an oversimplification and a caricature. I think since the end of the Cold War, the Russians have built up a pretty sizable middle class, right? And that middle class, it has earning potential and savings and things of that nature.
In Moscow, in St. Petersburg.
So I think it's hard to qualify like, okay, they're a tough people. Great. I mean, I don't know that that's. I think this is going to be pretty painful, and I think at this point, I would be surprised if the Russians were okay with going back into like a Cold War type of mentality where they're kept inside the country without information and things of that nature. They have information. The Russian system is not such that they can completely close it down. So they're going to continue to get information, and they're going to see their life savings go away, or they're going to become jobless.
But
right.
Look,
and so I think these are all new dynamics in the population that
I will give you an example. Like a few days ago, there is like this popular host in Lithuania who is a Russian. He has moved to Russia, from Russia to Lithuania, like, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. And he's doing these streams. He's chatting with, people in Russia. And those people are actually the ones that you're talking. They are kind of middle class because they have, gadgets, they have internet, and they have jobs. And like the last stream I saw was a few days ago. It was 5 hours. And like the ratio of people who understand what is happening in Ukraine is something like 2 to, only 2 from 10 understand that it's a war. The rest is actually brainwashed because, it's hard to imagine how a person of 20 in their 20s or 30s can be brainwashed, when there is all those connectivity possibilities. But they just think that, the Putin is doing a great job of saving some kind of Russian prestige.
But I think that's kind of anecdotal because the Russians I'm talking to aren't saying
that. Maybe you're talking to.
And hey, how many other countries have had as many revolutions as Russia has in the last 150 years as a result of failed initiatives? So I think we should keep that in mind. Yes, they're tough people, but that doesn't also mean that they're tolerant of really, really ridiculous policies by their leadership.
Yeah, and I would just second that and say we also need to not believe our own Kool-Aid in this situation. I think it's very hard to know like what the Russians are thinking discussion. Obviously, that doesn't apply across society. I think there's a lot of games going on with how Putin is trying to manage that. I think this rumor about martial law that came up was partially to get a lot of those inconvenient people to decide to leave, which some have done. I think there's a real effort underway to manage what is clearly pressure inside the country already. And I think, again, it's really hard to have visibility on that. I think we in the West often don't have the right gauge on, is that serious pressure? Is it like, something they're worried about? Is it something they just think needs to be let off? I don't know how to estimate that well, nor do I know anybody who has the magic lens on that. But I think it's clear that there's already signs that they are worried about how the Russian people are seeing this and how it will affect them. And while it is absolutely true that the Russians have been put more on a war economy mentality over the past years because of different rounds of sanctions, because of these games with like, you know, banning Parmesan cheese and bulldozing it in the streets or whatever. That's partially true, but there's a really big difference between, okay, stuff's not always great and I can't get Italian cheese, and like back to the, you have 2 beets a week and there's a ration card. But I think this would go back to the, we need to be creative and not wait in the wrong ways. There's some hesitation on implementing additional financial measures, which I would say, like, whatever we have left, crush it. Like, just crush it. That's the best hope we have.
Well, you should tell that to the Germans.
I do tell it to the Germans. But I mean, just there needs to not be caution on this, because it's if what everyone wants to say is we want to do everything not military first, then you have to do everything not military now. That is the best option that we have. When we see it's like, for once, there's actually enough of a weight on the side of sanctions, which are normally just kind of for show. And I think beyond sanctions, the reaction of industry, sort of the self-sanctioning, people just pulling out, cutting deals, it's not worth it for them anymore. Like, we get that now because it's the beginning of this. Everybody wants to avoid the reputational risk. That will not continue forever. So this, like, the unity of voluntary pain on Russia with the government and allied measures will not be sustainable forever. So if we want to sort of tip this over the edge, it's now that there's this pressure. I don't think it's sustainable in the long term.
Vaidotas, I want to ask you, what do you think? Is it safe to bet on the Russian society that the pressure will, you know, get the, you know, basically we will get from that what we want, or maybe it can backfire completely in a different way, because you had a chance, probably more, the most of from all the speakers here, including me, to understand the Russian mentality. What do you think? Is it completely different from what it was like in the 70s, 80s, or you know, there is still some different type of mentality in Russia?
Yeah, you know, it's another generation, you know, and this generation of young Russians who were born after the 90s, after the collapse of Soviet Union, they already saw the other part of the globe, not only, you know, Russia. So definitely they have new generation Russians. And I agree with Jeff that Russians are, you know, a revolutionary country. So a lot of, you know, revolutions actually happening in Russia. Only, you know, they need what? They need leadership who can hold that. That's the reason, you know, Putin is very eager to imprison his or even poison his opposition, you know. So he knows that those people can be very dangerous for him at a certain point. But I'm also coming back to that prognosis of the you know, end state of this war. Now we didn't talk about the dimension of China. Yes, definitely China probably should be satisfied about this war, because the benefits she will be probably a winner. But I don't think China would be happy if that war would escalate in between NATO and Russia on the wide scale. That is also for China. I don't think it's a interest, any kind of interest. And right now, and I think there is possibility that China can be kind of moderator between West and Russia. Yes, how to, and maybe they can help to facilitate some kind of possible peace. Even yesterday I saw that China has already agreed to be this player, but that's only very beginning, and of course we are very shy in criticizing, you know, Russia's action in Ukraine. So, but this is also interesting development, and we also have to watch very closely what China is doing.
So this raises a very interesting question, like because if China facilitates some kind of you know, peace, their reputation in the world is going to increase. So United States of America, would they let this narrative that China basically solved this crisis? What would that mean to the reputation of the United States if they let China solve this conflict? Because China, as you mentioned, is interested in having the wallets of Europeans and Americans paying for the goods that they produce. So, but United States, can they let China solve this conflict? Is it on the table for the reputation of United States?
That's a hard question. I don't think the United States, if for some reason, some magic, China suddenly showed up with a solution that solved the conflict to the satisfaction of all parties involved, the United States wouldn't stop that from happening. The chances of that happening, I think, are incredibly small. The Chinese have been walking this weird line where they're accusing us of all of our nuclear and biological labs, trying to go along with the Russians, but at the same time kind of criticizing the war. And so they're in a weird place. And I imagine they're kind of surprised with the solidarity of the West economically against Russia. Now, China's a whole different thing, and I'm not a China expert, but I'm sure they're watching that. I just don't see China playing an extremely constructive role in this, especially when they have journalists on the ground trying to support the Russian narrative. And so I just don't see where they would come up with some kind of solution that would satisfy us and the Ukrainians.
Molly?
Yeah, I think China is trying to play a weird game here, but is also perfectly happy to watch Russia and NATO eat each other alive if it comes to that. Like that would be a perfectly fine solution for them while they sit over there and have Cheetos while they're watching it on TV. But they are trying to insert themselves in some of these things. Who wouldn't, as a chance to gain status in what is going on? But I don't see that right now as being as much of a factor. Certainly, it's not what Washington is turning to for information or solutions. And it's not very clear to me that that's what Moscow is thinking either. So I don't know. But I think we'll see what happens. The Turks are trying to get into this too, and I don't know. Nobody's going to have the magic dust, though, I don't think.
Okay, so I see that we have kind of are approaching the time limit. So let's maybe finish with what should we do here in the West, especially in the region that is closer to Ukraine and to Russia. We already see the change from deterrence to defense, and all those troops that are being deployed in the region. What else should we do, to be prepared for any outcome, if that's the case?
One thing that I would add quickly, and I'm going to throw this out there because I have to jump. I have another thing after this as well. But I think on the European side, there has been this tremendous mobilization of the public. I think partially because the imagery from Ukraine is so visceral for people whose grandparents lived in cities getting bombed in World War II, and they know those stories and they know what this means. For America, it's a much more distant thing. But I think the way in which, for NATO countries, for Western countries, understanding that this is going to require a fair bit of public mobilization. I'm not talking conscription for war necessarily, but you need to get people paying attention to this. And in the way that I think European citizens are viewing themselves as participants in this, what can we do? How can we take in refugees? How can we raise money? How can we get supplies? How can we send money to the Ukrainian army? Do they need body armor? How do we get that to them? In the way that I think there's a lot of that activity here because of proximity as much as anything. I think the US government needs to think about that. And who knows what it is? Maybe it's a war bond, but Americans are already looking for ways to give money and time and support to Ukraine and to its fight. And our government can capitalize on that as a way of preparing society for the fact that this may not resolve quickly, and that they're going to need to be prepared for pain beyond just saying your gas prices are going to go up. That's not enough. Get people enlisted in this in a way that's mobilizing them. I think that's really important, in addition to all of the creative military and other thinking that needs to be happening, including unconventional stuff that we just everybody needs to get out all the binders and look at what the options are right now, because leaving them in the drawer is not going to help us get out of this. But thank you for having me on, and I really appreciate the chance to contribute. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Molly said. I think we really need to be preparing ourselves for the potential for this conflict to escalate. I know that inside, I mean, I know there are war games, there's other planning. I mean, I know that at least our administration has thought about this, and I imagine they've communicated to the Europeans, but there needs to be a public drive to really make people understand that this might get a lot more nasty over time. And maybe that's just the way it has to go. And on the support question you asked, I think we need more of much more of the same. I think more anti-tank, more air defense systems, and to be creative about providing those things and to continue to get those in, because the longer the Ukrainians can hold out and attrit Russian forces, the sooner this thing resolves itself, however that might turn out. But I also have to leave, so I've got to get going as well.
Okay, Jeffrey. So thanks a lot. We'll finish with Vaidotas, and have a good day, because it's you're in the States. So take care.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, tai mes su Vaidotu pabaigsim matyti lietuviškai. Jo, tai iš tikrųjų pakankamai niūrus scenarijus. Kaip pačiam atrodo, ar mes jau turėtume, kaip sakė Jeffris, komunikuoti visuomeniai, kad ruoškimės blogiausiam scenarijui, nes to mes vis tiek negirdim dar savo medijose, kad žodžiu, nežinau, pirkit ten amuniciją, maisto atsargas ir kitus dalykus, visko gali būti. Kaip jums atrodo, kokį mes galėtume, nes mes, aišku, nesprendžiam Lietuvoje ir NATO, mes toks pakankamai tylus balsas visam alijanse, aišku, mes stengiamės tapti pakankamai tokių lyderių, kažkuria prasme, nors čia matyti Lenkai jau šitą poziciją yra užėmę. Ir nieks jų iš tenais neišmes dėl grynai geografinių aplinkybių. Kaip mums ruoštis?
Aš manyčiau, kad Borisas Johnsonas davė, reiškia, labai geras gaires visam pasauliui, kaip šitą krizę valdyti. Ir mums belieka tik tai, sakysime, reiškia, irgi užsirašyti, prisijungti prie Boriso Johnsono, reiškia, tos vizijos. Tai pirmas dalykas, aišku, burtis į tarptautinę humanitarinę koaliciją pagalbos tiekimo ukrainiečiam, Ukrainoje. Antras žingsnis yra, reiškia, toliau aprūpinti ukrainiečius, kad jie galėtų ginti save. Tai yra ginklai ir visa kita, ko reikia. Ekonominės sankcijos Rusijai tęsti ir stiprinti. Tada tarptautinė bendruomenė turi, žodžiu, nedaleisti šito, kad Rusija įstengtų pasakyti, kad čia yra šita situacija normali, tai yra new normal, net šito negalima padaryti. Tada, aišku, diplomatiniai keliai turi būti ieškomi, tai va čia ta diskusija su Kinija galbūt irgi reiškia diplomatiniai keliai. Ir paskutinis, bet aš manau, irgi pats svarbiausias, gal ne pats svarbiausias, visi svarbus punktai, bet šitas mums irgi labai svarbus, tai yra greita kompanija, kuri, ta prasme, greiti veiksmai, kurie sustiprins saugumą ir reiškia, atgrasimą bei reiškia, resilience, tai atsparumą, reiškia, tarp NATO valstybių. Tai yra mes, kaip NATO valstybė, turime pakelti savo, reiškia, tą atsparumą, reiškia, gynybinį. Nes supraskim, kad alijansas yra toks stiprus, kaip stiprus jo yra nariai. Tai mums, sakykime, reiškia, ne tik tuos pirkti ginklus, bet mums reikia ir turėti tuos resursus, išnaudoti tuos resursus, kuriuos jau turime. Ir aš kalbu apie rezervą, apie jo suorganizavimą. Mums reikia daugiau karių, daugiau organizuotų karių. Ir nereikia klausyti tų, kurie sako, mes neturim tiek ginklų, bet mes, žodžiu, turim va tiek karių ir tiek ginklų reikia turėti. Ne, ginklų mes tikrai galėsim gauti tiek, kiek reikės. Mums svarbiausia reikia rankų ir kojų, kurios galės, ir galvų, kurie galės tuos ginklus, reiškia, galvot, kaip panaudoti ir kaip juos, reiškia, naudoti. Tai va, tai tokie, kaip sakant, mūsų gairės, ir aš pritariu Borisui Johnsonui, ir manau, kad bus, kaip bus. Tikėkime, kaip sako, geriausio, bet ruoškime blogiausiam, ir dabar tas metas. Tai va, mano tokia nuomonė, o kaip bus, pamatysim. Tikėkime, kad bus gerai.
Jo, taip filosofiškai, aišku, čia sunku kažką ir pridurti. Tai bet kokiu atveju, manau, kad žiūrovai išgirdo tam tikrą platesnę poziciją, nes vis tiek, kaip jau minėjau, kai yra pokalbiai su lietuviais, tai mes vis tiek turim tam tikrą ir tą bajas lietuvišką, o čia išgirdom žmonės, kurie jo nėra veikiami, aišku, jie turi savo bajas, bet kokiu atveju, kuo daugiau tų balsų, tuo aiškiau galima suvokti, kas vyksta. Ir ką, pirmiausia, tai aišku, dėkui Vaidotui, nes be jo visos šitos laidos nebūtų buvę. Čia buvo jo pasiūlymas ir iš tikrųjų buvo pradžioj dar kitas pašnekovas, bet teko sukeisti, nes Švedija, žodžiu, laikosi, kad tokiam temam per daug diskusijų neturi būti viešų, kas yra savaime suprantama. Tai Vaidotai, dėkui, tikiuosi pratęsim. Ir tikiuosi kitą kartą jau bus kažkokių geresnių natų, nes ypatingai Jeffrey tai buvo toks kaip tas, žodžiu, tokio baisaus scenarijaus, kuris, aišku, yra pakankamai realus. Tai ką, tai dėkui Jums. Dėkui visiems, kurie žiūrėjot. Nepamirškit mūsų socialiniuose tinkluose ir netikėkit propagandą, kuri yra skleidžiama apie neredaguotą, nes mes, kaip matot, neeskaluojam karo ar nepateikiam kažkokios dezinformacijos, bet kaip tik kalbame su žmonėm, kurie žino gerokai daugiau negu 99% visuomenės. Tai ką, dėkui ir iki kitų kartų.
Iki.
Taip, gerai, tai dabar sustabdom.